Charles Worthington stood at the podium, his voice steady as he addressed the crowd at the Suburban Elite Gala. "I'd like to introduce you to Zoe, my newly adopted daughter," he announced. The room fell silent, then erupted in hushed whispers and shocked gasps. Charles, a 55-year-old tech magnate, had just dropped a bombshell on his peers. As he continued his speech, Charles could hear the murmurs growing louder. "What's his angle?" one guest whispered. "Is this a publicity stunt?" Another wondered aloud. The speculation about his true intentions spread like wildfire through the ballroom. Zoe, a 10-year-old African-American girl, stood nervously at the edge of the stage. She fidgeted with the hem of her new dress, acutely aware of the curious stares directed her way. The bright lights and fancy decorations felt alien to her, a stark contrast to the life she'd known before. As guests approached to congratulate Charles, their eyes darted between him and Zoe, their smiles not quite reaching their eyes. Zoe felt like an exhibit on display, struggling to find her place in this unfamiliar world of wealth and privilege. Later that evening, Charles and Zoe returned to their sprawling mansion. The silence in the car ride home was deafening. Once inside, Charles attempted to strike up a conversation. "So, how did you like the party?" he asked, his tone hopeful. Zoe shrugged, her eyes downcast. "It was okay, I guess," she mumbled. Charles tried again. "I thought maybe we could set up your new room tomorrow. What color would you like the walls?" Zoe's mind flashed to her old room, shared with 3 other foster children. The peeling wallpaper, the creaky bunk beds. "I don't care," she replied, her voice barely audible. Charles sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he hadn't anticipated the wall of silence he was facing. As Zoe retreated to her temporary room, Charles was left wondering if he'd made the right decision. The challenge of connecting with this young girl seemed far more daunting than any business deal he'd ever faced. Charles was walking past Zoe's room when a crumpled paper near the door caught his eye. He picked it up, intending to toss it in the trash, but paused when he saw the intricate sketch of a robot on it. The design was surprisingly advanced for a 10-year-old, with detailed annotations and calculations scribbled in the margins. Intrigued, Charles knocked on Zoe's door. "Zoe, can I come in?" After a moment of silence, he heard a quiet, "Okay." He entered the room, holding up the drawing. "Did you make this?" Zoe nodded, her eyes wary. Charles sat on the edge of her bed, examining the sketch. "This is really impressive. Have you ever worked with robotics before?" Zoe shook her head. "Just drawings. We didn't have stuff like that at my old school." Charles saw an opportunity. "How would you like to learn more about robotics? We could get you some equipment, maybe enroll you in some classes." For the first time since her arrival, Zoe's eyes lit up. "Really? You do that?" The next week, Zoe's room was transformed into a makeshift workshop. She dove into her new project with enthusiasm, spending hours tinkering with circuits and coding. However, as the days passed, the pressure began to mount. She overheard Charles on the phone, boasting about her progress to his colleagues. "She's a natural," he said. "I wouldn't be surprised if she's building the next big thing in a few years." Zoe felt the weight of his expectations pressing down on her. She worked longer hours, skipping meals and losing sleep. The joy of creation was slowly being replaced by anxiety and stress. Meanwhile, at Zoe's new school, Mrs. Jenkins, the math teacher, was voicing her concerns to the principal. "This STEM program Mr. Worthington is pushing for is going to derail our entire curriculum," she argued. "We can't afford to divert resources from our core subjects." The principal sighed. "Mrs. Jenkins, we need to consider all options. Mr. Worthington's donation could revolutionize our school." Mrs. Jenkins shook her head. "At what cost? We're educators, not tech incubators. Our job is to provide a well-rounded education, not to produce the next Silicon Valley wunderkind." As the adults debated, Zoe sat in her next class, her mind racing with robot designs and lines of code, struggling to focus on the lesson at hand. The worlds of her past, present, and potential future collided, leaving her caught in the middle of a storm she didn't fully understand. Charles stood at the front of the community center, facing a crowd of skeptical parents and educators. "The STEM program I'm proposing will open doors for our children," he said, gesturing to the slideshow behind him. It's about preparing them for the jobs of tomorrow. Murmurs rippled through the audience. A hand shot up. Mr. Worthington, how do we know this isn't just a way for you to recruit future employees on the cheap? The question was met with nods of agreement. Charles took a deep breath. I understand your concerns, but this isn't about my company. It's about giving these kids opportunities they might not otherwise have. Another voice called out, easy for you to say. You can afford to experiment with our kids' futures. As the meeting devolved into heated arguments, Zoe slipped out the back door. She wandered to a nearby playground, where she noticed a boy about her age sitting alone on a swing. Hi, she said cautiously. I'm Zoe. The boy looked up. Lucas, he replied. You're new around here, right? The rich guy's kid? Zoe winced. He adopted me. I'm not. I wasn't always rich. Lucas nodded. Yeah, I get it. My mom works 2 jobs. Dad's not around. He kicked at the dirt. School's a joke. They don't teach us anything useful. Zoe perked up. That's what Charles is trying to change. He wants to bring in more science and technology classes. Lucas snorted. Yeah, right. Like they'd ever listen to kids like us. Zoe hesitated, then said, what if we showed them? I've been working on this robotics project. Maybe if we did something cool, they'd have to pay attention. Lucas looked skeptical but intrigued. You know how to build robots? I'm learning, Zoe said. Want to help? Over the next few weeks, Zoe and Lucas spent every free moment working on their project. They met in the school library, poring over books on robotics and coding. During lunch breaks, they sketched designs and debated ideas. Their enthusiasm was contagious. Other students began to take notice, asking questions and offering suggestions. Even Mrs. Jenkins, walking by one day, paused to observe their work with a mixture of curiosity and concern. As their robot began to take shape, so did their friendship. For the first time since her adoption, Zoe felt like she belonged. And Lucas, who had always felt invisible, was starting to see a future beyond his circumstances. But not everyone was supportive. Whispers followed them in the hallways. Teachers' pets, some called them. Worthington's little puppets, others sneered. Yet Zoe and Lucas pressed on, driven by a shared vision and the hope of making a difference. Mrs. Jenkins strode into the classroom, her face set in a stern expression. Zoe, Lucas, I need to speak with you, she said, gesturing for them to follow her into the hallway. Once outside, she crossed her arms. I understand you've been working on a robotics project. Lucas nodded defiantly. Yeah, what about it? Mrs. Jenkins sighed. While I appreciate your enthusiasm, I can't allow you to disrupt other students or use school resources for unauthorized projects. This stops now. Zoe's face fell. But Mrs. Jenkins, we're not disrupting anyone. We're just trying to show what we can do with the right tools. The teacher's expression softened slightly. I know you mean well, but... Just then, a group of students walked by, chattering excitedly about Zoe and Lucas's robot. Mrs. Jenkins paused, watching their animated faces. She turned back to Zoe and Lucas, a thoughtful look in her eyes. Tell me more about this project of yours. As Zoe and Lucas explained their ideas, Mrs. Jenkins's resistance began to crumble. She saw the passion in their eyes, the depth of their knowledge. All right, she said finally. You can continue, but under my supervision. And it can't interfere with your regular studies. Weeks later, Charles and Zoe found themselves in a television studio, preparing for a live interview about innovation in education. The bright lights and bustling crew made Zoe nervous, but Charles squeezed her hand reassuringly. And we're live in 3, 2, 1. The host smiled at the camera. Today we're joined by tech mogul Charles Worthington and his adopted daughter Zoe, who are spearheading a controversial STEM program in their local school district. As Charles answered questions about the program's goals, Zoe fidgeted in her seat. Finally, the host turned to her. Zoe, what do you hope to achieve with this program? Zoe took a deep breath. I want kids like me to have a chance, she said, her voice growing stronger. In my old school, we didn't have computers or science labs, but now I'm building robots and learning to code. Every kid should have that opportunity. The studio audience murmured appreciatively, but online, the reaction was mixed. Supportive comments flooded in, praising Zoe's eloquence and passion. But critics also emerged, questioning Charles's motives and accusing him of exploiting Zoe for publicity. As they left the studio, Charles's phone buzzed with notifications. He glanced at the screen, his brow furrowing at the harsh comments. But when he looked at Zoe, beaming with pride at her performance, he knew they were on the right path, regardless of the challenges ahead. Zoe and Lucas huddled over their robot in the school library, making last-minute adjustments before the science fair. Their heads snapped up at the sound of laughter. A group of older students stood nearby, pointing and snickering. "Look at the little nerds," one boy jeered, thinking they're so special with their fancy robot. Lucas tensed, his fists clenching. Zoe put a hand on his arm. "Ignore them," she whispered. "They're just jealous." As the bullies sauntered away, Lucas slumped in his chair. "Maybe we should just quit. No one takes us seriously anyway." Zoe shook her head firmly. "No way. We've worked too hard. Besides, remember what Mrs. Jenkins said? We're inspiring other kids." Their resolve strengthened. They threw themselves into their work with renewed vigor. The bullying continued, but so did their determination. Meanwhile, Charles sat in the audience at the science fair, watching Zoe present their project with confidence and enthusiasm. As he listened to her explain complex concepts with ease, he felt a mixture of pride and unease. He thought back to his own childhood, growing up in a privileged household where success was expected. He remembered the pressure, the constant need to prove himself. Was he putting the same pressure on Zoe? Charles glanced around at the other parents, noting their impressed looks. He'd always prided himself on being open-minded, on giving opportunities to those less fortunate. But as he watched Zoe interact with her peers, he realized he still harbored his own biases and insecurities. Later that week, Mrs. Jenkins asked to meet with Charles after school. As they sat in her classroom, she hesitated before speaking. "Mr. Worthington, I owe you an apology. I was skeptical about your program at first, but I've seen the change in our students." Charles nodded, surprised. "Thank you, Mrs. Jenkins. Your support means a lot." She smiled wryly. "I understand these kids more than you might think. I grew up in foster care myself. Education was my way out." Charles blinked, taken aback. "I had no idea." Mrs. Jenkins leaned forward. "That's why I pushed back initially. I worried we were setting these kids up for disappointment, but now I see the potential. I'd like to help expand the program, if you're open to it." As they discussed plans, Charles felt a shift in his perspective. He'd seen Mrs. Jenkins as an obstacle, but now he realized she could be a valuable ally. More importantly, her personal story reminded him that assumptions and prejudices could cloud anyone's judgment, even his own. The school buzzed with excitement as students crowded around Zoe and Lucas's latest robotics demonstration. Mrs. Jenkins stood nearby, beaming with pride as she explained the project to a local news reporter. "This program has transformed our school," she said. "Students who were previously disengaged are now excited about learning. It's not just about robotics. It's about problem-solving and critical thinking." The reporter nodded, scribbling notes. "And this all started with Charles Worthington's adopted daughter?" Mrs. Jenkins frowned slightly. "Zoe and Lucas initiated the project, yes. But it's grown beyond that now. It's a community effort." As the bell rang, signaling the end of the demonstration, Zoe and Lucas high-fived. "We did it." Lucas grinned. "Did you see how many kids wanted to join our club?" Zoe nodded, her eyes shining. "I can't believe it. We're actually making a difference." Their celebration was cut short by the arrival of the principal, looking both excited and nervous. "Zoe, Lucas, I have some news. Your project has caught the attention of the National Robotics Competition. They've invited you to participate next month in Chicago." The kids' jaws dropped. "Are you serious?" Lucas stammered. The principal nodded. "It's a big opportunity, but it's also a big commitment. You'll need to prepare extensively." As word spread about the competition, Charles felt a mix of emotions. Pride in Zoe's accomplishments warred with anxiety about the pressure she'd be under. He found himself spending hours in his home office, making calls and pulling strings to ensure Zoe and Lucas had everything they needed to succeed. One evening, as he pored over competition rules, Zoe knocked on his door. "Charles? Can we talk? He looked up, noticing the dark circles under her eyes. Of course. What's on your mind? Zoe hesitated. I'm scared. What if we mess up? Everyone's counting on us. Charles felt a pang of guilt. Had he pushed her too hard? Zoe, he said gently, the only thing that matters is that you do your best. Win or lose, I'm proud of you. As the competition drew nearer, the entire community rallied around Zoe and Lucas. Bake sales were organized to fund their trip. Local businesses donated supplies. Even former critics of the program offered their support. But with the increased attention came increased scrutiny. Charles found himself fielding calls from skeptical board members and concerned parents, all questioning the wisdom of putting so much pressure on young students. As he prepared to accompany the kids to Chicago, he couldn't shake the feeling that everything he'd worked for hung in the balance. The convention center in Chicago buzzed with activity as teams from across the country set up their projects. Zoe and Lucas stood at their booth, nervously adjusting their robot's components. What if it doesn't work? Lucas whispered, his hands shaking slightly. Zoe took a deep breath. We've tested it 100 times. It'll work. As the judges made their rounds, Charles watched from the sidelines, his heart racing. He'd faced high-stakes business deals before, but nothing compared to the anxiety of watching Zoe and Lucas present their project. Everything seemed to be going smoothly until suddenly, mid-demonstration, their robot stuttered to a halt. Zoe's eyes widened in panic. Lucas froze, staring at the judges. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then, almost instinctively, Zoe and Lucas sprang into action. While Zoe calmly explained the robot's functions to the judges, Lucas ducked behind the table, frantically checking connections. This is actually a great opportunity to demonstrate our troubleshooting process, Zoe said smoothly, buying time for Lucas. The judges looked impressed by their composure. After a tense minute, Lucas emerged, grinning. He'd found a loose wire. The robot whirred back to life, completing its demonstration flawlessly. As the judges moved on, Zoe and Lucas shared a relieved look. Their teamwork had saved the day. From his spot in the audience, Charles felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Watching Zoe handle the crisis with such poise, he realized she'd grown more than he'd noticed. She wasn't just following his plan. She was carving her own path. The awards ceremony was a blur of anticipation. When Zoe and Lucas's names were called for second place, the auditorium erupted in cheers. As they accepted their trophy, beaming with pride, Charles felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to see a woman in a crisp suit. Mr. Worthington? I'm Sarah Chun from EdTech Ventures. We were very impressed by your team's project. We'd like to discuss potential funding to expand your program. Charles's mind raced. This was the kind of opportunity he'd been hoping for. But as he watched Zoe and Lucas celebrating with their peers, he hesitated. That's a generous offer, Ms. Chun, but I'll need to discuss it with my team first. This project is about more than just technology. It's about community. Ms. Chun nodded, handing him her card. Of course. We look forward to hearing from you. As Charles pocketed the card, he realized the true victory wasn't the trophy or the potential funding. It was seeing Zoe and Lucas grow, watching a community come together, and learning that success could mean something different than he'd always thought. Months after the competition, Zoe stood at a podium, addressing a crowd at a local STEM advocacy event. Her voice, once timid, now rang out with confidence. We need diverse voices in science and technology, she said. Every kid, regardless of their background, should have the chance to innovate and create. The audience applauded enthusiastically. Among them, Charles noticed several of his business associates, nodding approvingly. As Zoe stepped down, a reporter approached her. Zoe, how do you respond to critics who say this program is just a publicity stunt for Worthington Industries? Zoe paused, then spoke carefully. This program isn't about any one person or company. It's about giving kids like me a chance we might not have had otherwise. Meanwhile, across town, a group of community members gathered in a small coffee shop. Worthington's turning our school into his personal tech incubator, one man grumbled. And what about the arts? Sports? We're losing funding for everything else, another added. The murmurs of discontent grew louder. echoing concerns that had been simmering for months. Back at the event, Charles mingled with supporters, shaking hands and discussing future plans. A school board member pulled him aside. "Charles, we need to talk. There's growing opposition to the program. Some parents are threatening to transfer their kids out of the district." Charles frowned, but the results speak for themselves. Test scores are up, attendance is improving. The board member sighed. "Numbers aren't everything. People are worried about the soul of our community." As Charles pondered this, he saw Zoe chatting animatedly with a group of younger students, her eyes shining with enthusiasm. He realized that while they'd made great strides, they'd also created division. That evening, Charles and Zoe sat at their kitchen table, preparing for a community meeting the next day. "We need to address their concerns head-on," Charles said, rubbing his temples. Zoe nodded, then hesitated. "Charles, are we doing the right thing? I love this program, but I don't want to cause problems." Charles looked at her, seeing not just his adopted daughter, but a partner in this endeavor. "Change is never easy, Zoe, but I believe we're making a difference. We just need to find a way to bring everyone along with us." As they worked late into the night, refining their presentation and brainstorming ways to address the community's concerns, neither of them realized that the biggest challenge to their vision was yet to come. The community center was packed, tension thick in the air as Charles and Zoe took their seats at the front. The moderator, a local councilwoman, called the meeting to order. "We're here to discuss the impact of the STEM program on our schools and community," she began. "Mr. Worthington, would you like to start?" Charles stood, his prepared speech in hand. "Over the past year, we've seen remarkable progress." "Progress for who?" a voice interrupted. A man stood up, his face red with anger. "For your company's future workforce?" Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Charles tried to regain control. "This program benefits all students." The man cut him off again. "Does it? Or does it just benefit your agenda?" He pulled out a folder. "I've done some digging, Mr. Worthington. 10 years ago, you were involved in a failed educational technology venture. A venture that left several school districts in financial ruin." The room erupted in shocked whispers. Charles felt the blood drain from his face. He'd hoped that chapter of his past was behind him. "Is this true?" the moderator asked, looking stunned. Charles took a deep breath. "It's complicated. Yes, there was a project that didn't pan out as we'd hoped. But that's precisely why I'm so committed to getting it right this time." The crowd wasn't buying it. Shouts of "liar" and "fraud" filled the air. Suddenly, Zoe stood up. "Wait," she yelled, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Please, just listen." The room quieted, all eyes on the young girl. "I know you're all scared and angry," Zoe said, her voice shaking slightly. "But I'm not here because of some big plan. I'm here because Charles gave me a chance when no one else would." She looked around the room, meeting hostile gazes with determination. "Before this program, I didn't think I had a future. Now, I'm building robots and dreaming of college. Isn't that worth something?" The crowd murmured, some faces softening, but the man with the folder wasn't finished. "Noble words, but it doesn't change the fact that your adopted father has a history of using children for his own gain." Charles started to protest, but Zoe beat him to it. "You're wrong," she said firmly. "Charles isn't perfect, but he believed in me. He's teaching me that it's okay to make mistakes as long as you learn from them and try to do better." As Zoe continued to speak, defending not just the program but the man who had given her a new life, the mood in the room began to shift. The community remained divided, but seeds of understanding had been planted. As the meeting descended into heated debates, Charles's mind raced. The face of the man who had exposed his past seemed familiar. Suddenly, it clicked. "Wait a minute," he said, standing up. "I know you. You're James Ryder, aren't you?" The man's eyes widened in surprise. "How do you?" "You were on the development team for that educational technology project 10 years ago," Charles continued. "The one that failed." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Charles turned to address the room. "What Mr. Ryder didn't mention is that he was the lead programmer on that project. The one who assured us the software was ready for deployment when it wasn't." Ryder's face flushed. "That's not true. You rushed the launch. You didn't give us enough time." I made mistakes, Charles admitted, cutting him off. I was too focused on results, on being first to market. I didn't listen to the educators who warned us we were moving too fast. And when it all fell apart, I took the blame publicly to protect the team. Including you, James. The room fell silent, all eyes darting between Charles and Ryder. Charles took a deep breath. I learned a hard lesson then. That's why this time, we're doing things differently. We're working with educators, listening to the community. Yes, I've made mistakes, but I'm trying to make amends, to do something truly good. As the gravity of the revelation sank in, Zoe stood up. I have something to show you, she said, her voice steady. She nodded to Lucas, who wheeled in a large covered object. For the past few months, we've been working on this, Zoe explained, pulling off the cover to reveal a complex, interactive display. It's an AI-driven learning system that adapts to each student's needs and interests. The crowd leaned in, fascinated, as Zoe demonstrated how the system worked. It combines all subjects, math, science, art, history, and presents them in a way that's engaging for every learning style. Charles watched, amazed. This was far beyond anything he'd seen Zoe working on before. We built this using the skills we learned in the STEM program, Zoe continued. But we also worked with artists, historians, and students from all backgrounds. Because we realized that true innovation comes from collaboration, from bringing different perspectives together. As Zoe's presentation concluded, the mood in the room had transformed. Even the staunchest critics were nodding, impressed by what these students had accomplished. Charles felt a surge of emotion. He realized that while he'd been focused on defending his vision, Zoe had been quietly revolutionizing it. She hadn't just learned about technology, she learned how to bridge divides and bring people together. In that moment, Charles understood that the true success of his endeavor wasn't measured in test scores or funding, but in the growth and empowerment of students like Zoe. He had set out to change the community, but in the end, the community, and most of all, Zoe, had changed him.